Hello again to this series of the 7 generations alive today. The Saturn cycle is the key to changes that humans follow from birth to death. Having a generation be 14 years harmonized both with Saturn and the 3 outer planets. With Pluto's eccentric orbits since 1940, this planet, along with Neptune, traveled as a pair separated by 60 degrees, a sextile. Moreover, Uranus traveled 2 sides during this time. In the previous session, the first generation, starting in 1927 to 1941, had Uranus in Aries and Taurus, while Pluto was in Cancer and Neptune in Virgo. This was the forgotten generation, where fire was castrated, resulting in individuals that faded away from the concept of right equals might. Instead, they softened Saturn or their father's role from the stern disciplinarian to create new ways to relate with children. The flower child generation started with the Second World War and lasted to about 1956. Pluto shifted to Leo while Neptune went into Libra. Uranus was in Gemini during the first half and then into Cancer, the second half. The first half features the flower child as Prometheus, the winged messenger. Their message changed the world. Pluto was in Leo, and Samsons were everywhere in the Second World War. The sides were clear. You were either the good guys and the enemies were evil. It was a glorious war. Even today, the war makes an excellent backdrop for books and movies. Uranus, the awakener of the Gemini mind, was everywhere as technological advances giving new weapons of mass destruction, capped with the atomic bomb. These technological advances spilled over into peacetime with objective desires for the winning teams. There was an explosion of industry that led to prosperity and peace, lasting a short time before the forces of darkness again threatened the world of the West. Hitler was threatened by the same force. He viewed communism as the forces of ice and collectivism, while the Aryan was the fire force. It meant the death of the hero if communism swept the world. After the defeat of Germany, the torch was passed to the United States to fight the terrors of the forces of darkness. The fire was dimming as the powers of the West were losing ground throughout the world. The Cold War was declared. Saturn was in Cancer during a large portion of the Second World War. People had to get a grip on fear. When Saturn transited the degree that Pluto occupied when it was born, the atomic bomb became the ultimate fear. There was an irreversible change when Pluto had its first conjunction with Saturn in the sign of Leo in 1947. Many prophecies were fulfilled during this passage. Israel was portioned off, creating discontent leading to a deadly situation that exists today. The technology of the nuclear bomb and later the hydrogen bomb became known by more than one country, setting up the dyad, West and the forces of fire, and East and the forces of ice. Pluto's solution in dealing with an addiction is to go to the max till you can't go anymore and then become its opposite. In the previous generation, Pluto in Cancer brought people into the depths of fear till they died or became its opposite in Capricorn and the Father. The World War II generation, the participants of that time, went to the max in a glorious war. The children born during these times became their opposites, the Aquarian. As mentioned, Saturn was the first heavy weight to transit Pluto. Since these planets are incompatible, their cycle would mirror the Jupiter-Saturn cycle. In this cycle, Saturn would go first, leading to an event horizon and a trip into Hades or Hell. Saturn deals with authority. It is designed to respond when someone breaks the law. Saturn is the police. The opposition occurred in 1964 during the conjunction of Uranus-Pluto. It was this passage that split the world in the 60s and will be further discussed in the next generation. This event started the Pluto half of the cycle, where the governing forces were kidnapped, leading to repressed desires in the police that surfaced by the police riot in 1968. Neptune and Libra during the war made all relationships very alluring. Imagine being in a situation where you are leaving for the war. It is so easy to get hooked in the romance when it's your last night before shipping out. Many lovers were separated for years, making the illusion even more intense. For many, after the war, disillusionment came, and these times brought divorce into the mainstream. The Flower Child had to grow up very fast as a result of the Vietnam War. This was the last war that had a draft. When a young man became 19 and didn't have a deferment, he was destined to go into harm's way. As mentioned, this war was not glorious like the Great War. This war was against people that you couldn't even recognize. They had no uniform and were identical to the people living their lives. As with the Korean War, there were guidelines that prevent the forces of fire to win. Unlike Korea, they lost this war. This war had a viewing. Every night, the news on TV reported the atrocities and the evils of war. Throughout the years, the American people were subject to lies regarding their strength, and that victory was assured if they sent more troops to the slaughterhouse. The Flower Child, at a very young age, had stepped up to the people in charge and implemented a policy of nonviolent resistance to the war. From this beginning, the Flower Child, with their clear rhetoric, moved the masses that were willing to listen to them. These kids have something to say. It was a challenge for the establishment to listen to a bunch of young hippies. But for those that did, they were rewarded with new insights on the evils of technology, the medical profession, and ecology, which were addressed for the first time. The anti-war movement spread to other areas like women's rights, homosexuality, and the plight of the minorities. The movement became so powerful that the establishment was threatened like never before. Steps had to be taken to return to control. The New Age was their answer. The trine between Uranus and Gemini with Neptune and Libra is the marriage of the mental and the goddess of love. Their music was their communication. The pill irreversibly changed society's taboo regarding sex. For the first time, women were given permission to enjoy it. The concept of unisexuality was common. The product was the aquarium. They wanted to fly, and for many, drugs were the answer. As mentioned previously, the aquarium embraces drugs for consciousness. Some foolishly chose a drug with too much risk and went down a deadly path. However, their favorites were marijuana and psychedelics. These drugs really scared their adversaries, the World War II gang. This gang were addicted to drugs that made them a hero in some glorious plot, alcohol being a favor. Thus, drugs became a battleground. We'll talk more about the 60s in the next generation. They were born in it. Prometheus stole consciousness from the gods and shared it with his brothers and sisters, and was punished by having the eagle peck away at his liver, the ability to tell right from wrong, the sign of Virgo. This sign is the theme in the next generation. Things really changed when Uranus went into Cancer. These were the 50s and a big renewal of fear with the communist threat. Uranus now comes into square aspect to Neptune in Libra. This signals the yin portion of the Cancer script. This is where the dead mother is kicked by her child that she screams for fair play. The children born during this time came to an age when the Vietnam War really became ugly. The Tet Offensive made it obvious that the masses were being lied to. 1968 to 70 was the turning point and the start of the next half of this generation. Protesting in the streets became ugly after the Chicago Convention. The World War II generation took the gloves off as expressed in Kent State. Uranus in Cancer, as described by many of the women born with it, has hormones going to the extremes. Many wanted a child so desperately they didn't care with whom. To others, they had their tubes tied at 16. Regarding drugs, some could, but many couldn't. The illusions quickly turned to disillusions, giving bad trips. These natives brought the signal mom to the mainstream. To the unisex males, it was free love and off they went to seek out freedom. Women started crushing the illusion of being the nurturer to their brother. The cry for equality became their banner, and the women's liberation movement became a reality. Saturn in conjunction with Neptune in Libra and its square aspect to Uranus in Cancer highlighted this yin portion of the flower child generation. For a short period of time, there was peace between the sexes, but anger developed because of the lack of fair play. Feminism became an angry term to males, while male chauvinism was the female battle cry. Homosexuality was on the rise. Aquarian on the cusp of the 8th house is the energy that brings down the flower child. The unisex concept of the male leading to the abandoned mom created the shift of the nurturing mother to the father and the bearer of responsibility. This brought on a shift to a more conservative standard, and the yuppie was born, along with a new drug, workaholism. To be a yuppie, you had to be a consumer, and capitalism flourished as they used their intuitive wisdom to win big in the game of making money. They introduced the concept of deficit spending, and credit card debt became a reality. Thus, one generation made an irreversible change in the world scene. They rebelled against the World War II and created a split that is still visible today. Later generations have returned to the World War II concepts, keeping these divisions possible years later. So far, we have 3 active generations. The World War II gang, which saw the world of 1945, where there was a clear distinction between the good guys, the U.S., and the forces of evil. They became the conservatives that strive to keep America great. The first generation, the Depression generations, are the happers. They either joined the World War II gang or the flower child generation. The number 3 generation, I call it the Gothic gang, includes the time from 1956 to 1970. They were born during the hectic 60s. So please join me for the next edition of the Generations. Until then, be happy.